And as we were discussing which way the conversation should go when the cameras were turned on that evening after the Holocaust final program, I said, Frau Harprecht, what I would like to say is I think a lot of viewers back in Germany would just like to hear you describe everything you actually saw with your own eyes. After all, you're an Auschwitz survivor, and there are not many of them who've actually got such clear recollections probably as yourself. Why don't you just tell the audience everything that you yourself saw? This must be interesting for the 20 million television viewers who are going to be tuned in that night. And she was a bit flattered, and she said, well, yes, although it's very painful, of course, I don't like discussing it. This is, of course, the first evasion. What she probably herself saw was probably the laundry or something like that. I don't know. She probably saw one tiny camp, one tiny corner of this huge industrial complex, this synthetic rubber factory. But then when I went on to say the following, I said, you see, Frau Harprecht, when you finish describing it, I would like also then to ask this question. Isn't your existence in front of the cameras tonight a living, flesh and blood proof that all is not well with the Holocaust mythology, which gives us the picture of Auschwitz as being a ruthless, dedicated extermination center, and Adolf Hitler as being a man bent on liquidating every single living Jew? And she said, I don't understand what you're saying. And so I said, Frau Harprecht, there are many people like you, and I'm glad of it. There are millions and millions of survivors, and I'm puzzled about why. And she said, producer, Herr so-and-so, if Mr. Irving asks this question tonight in front of the cameras, I shall get up and storm out of the studio. I have never been so... And in this way, the producer turned appealingly to me and said, Mr. Irving, please don't ask this question tonight. Now, let me make quite plain so there's no misunderstandings. I'm not challenging the Holocaust. This word has now become a kind of trademark. I sometimes expect to see the word the Holocaust with TM after it, as though it applies only to one specific tragedy. There were very many tragedies in World War II, and as I've gone round the whole of Down Under on television, coast to coast, wall to wall television, they couldn't get away from me. My face on the television screens night after night, thanks to Raymond White and Veritas. As I said again and again, the tragedy of World War II wasn't the killing of Jews or the killing of gypsies or the killing of homosexuals or whatever. The real tragedy of World War II was the killing of innocents, innocenticide. That is a word that I've created, I have coined, and I think it is sufficiently general not to offend anybody at all. Jews come into it, of course. If there were any innocent Jews and they were killed, then they, of course, become victims of this crime of innocenticide. The crime was not that they were killed because they were Jewish. The crime is that they were killed and they were innocent. And, of course, if you then enlarge the crime to the killing of innocents, the Germans weren't the only people guilty of this crime. It then slops over a bit onto some of the other victorious powers like your own, President Roosevelt, and what happened in Hiroshima, Nagasaki. When we know a little bit more about that, we begin to find grave parallels. So I'm not challenging any of the central core stories of the Holocaust. There was a huge tragedy of some kind or other. I do challenge, however, the version which has been so glibly presented that Adolf Hitler himself ordered it. And just as we were conned about that particular tragedy, so we've been conned about Winston Churchill and World War II. There's no question at all. World War II, I mean, you only have to look at certain logical issues that are raised by World War II from an English point of view. Why were we fighting in it? And you ask the British this and the man in the street, and they come up immediately with three different answers. The first answer they say is, well, of course we had to fight it because of Poland. But instantly there's another man next to him who says, no, it wasn't Poland, it was because of defending the British Empire. And those two are shouted down by the third one who says, of course we had no choice but to fight because we were fighting the devil incarnate, Adolf Hitler. So you've got three excuses for fighting, three war aims. But of course the Poland one is completely baloney, because by the end of 1939 Poland had ceased to exist and nobody was defending Poland, nobody was fighting on behalf of Poland by the time the war ended. In fact, we were rather fighting against Poland's interests. I think if any nation suffered from World War II, it was Poland. So they had no cause to thank the British or the Americans or anybody else for coming to their rescue. In fact, if we hadn't fought on behalf of Poland in 1939, I think personally Poland and the Poles, as human beings, would have been very much better off. This is, by the way, the main thing which I'm concerned with is Churchill. When he came to power in May 1940, he invented a new war aim. We are fighting to defend the British Empire, he said. And this war aim militated onwards throughout 1940, 1941. 2 years long, Churchill was able to proclaim this as being the war aim, the reason to carry on fighting, the reason for prolonging the war. If we don't fight on, effectively, Hitler will invade the British Empire and we have to defend it. And of course, at the end of 1941, you couldn't have that war aim any longer because the Americans are in the war. And you're not going to get one GI to go to the battlefield to defend the British Empire. So, but imperceptibly, rather like wall-to-wall carpeting, you can't see where the join is, but the colour somehow at the other end of the wall has changed. Imperceptibly, we have a new war aim, and this one now is, we're not fighting for Poles or British Empire, we're fighting the devil incarnate, Nazism, or putting it in a positive light, we are fighting for freedom, civilization, and all that we hold dear, capital letters all the way through, all that we hold dear. Well, of course, this sounds jolly good until you realize what the Americans were making us do for it. The Americans weren't rushing into battle to defend the British Empire and all that we hold dear, whether it's British or not. The Americans were doing it for money. And I'm going to be rude to those of you Americans who are here now, although you probably realize this yourselves. If you ever wondered why you are now rich and we are now poor, don't let appearances deceive you. I'm extremely poor. The reason is this. You took us to the cleaners, and I don't mean Sketchley Brothers. You took us to the cleaners from 1941 onwards, and you did it very efficiently, and you did it so sneakily that the British people never found out. It went like this. Imagine I'm walking down the street, and I see an old lady on the other side of the street being mugged stupid by niggers, by people of a different race on the other side of the road, and she's being mugged absolutely blind by these two. We rush across the road. And we say, "Madam, let me help." This is what you say if you're American. "Madam, let me help." And she said, "Oh, thank you so much. I'm being mugged stupid by these two gentlemen." And you say, "But madam, I see you've got a handbag there. Before I help you, give me all your small change." This is what the Americans did to us in the first half of 1940. They took all our small change. Everything we had in cash and movables they took. And then we notice, of course, at the bottom of the handbag is her checkbook. So we say, "Madam, I'd like to help you a great deal, and all that we hold dear, I'd like to help you, but would you mind writing out a check for every penny you got in the bank, too?" This is what President Roosevelt did to us from 1940 onwards. In December 1940, after Roosevelt had taken every pound and every dollar and every French franc and Deutschmark that we had, every ounce of foreign currency that we had, Roosevelt had taken out of our bank. And after he'd taken all our gold, and after Roosevelt had found out that we still had 28 million pounds or so of gold left in South Africa belonging to Britain, he sent a battleship to Simonstown Naval Base in South Africa to pick up our last remaining gold. He then found out that the old lady still has a checkbook in the bottom, and he asked us to clean out all the foreign investments we've got. And then she finds out that she's got some old stocks and shares too lying around, or he suspects and he says, "Madam, do you have any stocks and shares you can sell up in a hurry?" And she's kind of going like this and says, "Well, yes, I think I have. And he says, "Well, if you promise to do that, then I'll think about helping you." That's what the Americans did to us in 1941. There's no question at all. If you read the Morgenthau papers, which are in the Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, Roosevelt took us to the cleaners. He made us give up all our money, all our gold, sell up all our stocks and shares, everything we had. Every investment we had in the United States and in South America, including everything in the Western Hemisphere, had to be sold off before the end of 1941, beginning with the Viscose Corporation of America, which was British, worth 150 million pounds in 1941, sold to 35 million pounds to the Morgan Bank in Wall Street. You notice the difference between value and the actual money you get? Well, that's how it is, isn't it? If you're a little bit hard up, all your friends club round and help you. And Bill Jones down the street buys your colour TV for $15, and the other neighbour on the other side of the road says, "I'll give you $7 for your record player," and somebody else buys your grand piano for $20, and they're all kidding themselves, they're helping you out. They are, of course, they're helping you out of everything you've got. And that's what the Americans did with us, with the British, from 1941 onwards. But Winston Churchill concealed it from us, and he actually avowed his intention of concealing it from us, because when Morgenthau went to see him in August 1944, as you see from Churchill's diary, which I've got, when Morgenthau went to see Churchill on 4th of August 1944, had lunch with him, Morgenthau said to Mr. Churchill, "Prime Minister, how you intend breaking it to the British people that you've bankrupted them by fighting this war?" And Churchill's reply was, "That is a doleful task that I propose to leave to my successor." But he didn't tell us, and his successor Clement Attlee didn't tell the British either. The British people never found out that to fight Churchill's war, which is the war from 1940 onwards to the end, 1945, had bankrupted us, had cost us all our overseas investments, had reduced Britain to penury. Everything which 300 years of British empire building had built up had gone, and we never found out. The British people never told. And people, you can sucker an entire public. It's happening today over South Africa. It's happening today in countless places around the world. You can sucker an entire public into believing something different. Because, as Churchill himself said, there's no public opinion, only published opinion. And we know who controls the press worldwide, which is what I'm going to come on to in the last part of my talk, what we're going to do about that. So you see, in fact, ladies and gentlemen, if you go to London now, you'll find the English people there in all their old imperial arrogance. The glint of imperial wisdom in their eye, they believe the empire is out there somewhere. Not lost, just mislaid temporarily. You've only got to go down the road to the lost empire. You know, you're going to get it back. And the evidence is all those lovely tourists from the empire visiting at this moment. 6 million of them, some of them have been there 20 or 30 years now, not behaving very nicely, this is true, but we accept their petrol bombs and whatever else they throw at us. We accept it because it's the proof that the empire is out there somewhere. And this is why we gentle English folk put up with this humiliation. And it is a humiliation, believe me, ladies and gentlemen, it's a terrible humiliation. What's happened now to Britain? You go back to Britain and your passport, as an Englishman, your passport is checked by a Pakistani passport control officer. This isn't an exaggeration. You will find that the odds are over 80% that you will have a passport officer who's Pakistani checking an Englishman's passport, somebody born in England 50 years ago, and a recent Commonwealth immigrant is finding out if you're valid to come in or not. How long do you intend staying in England, sir, he will say. And I say, get lost, I was born here 50 years ago. This is the humiliation of Britain because we haven't had a government, there's a democratic government in Britain for the last 50 years. By democratic government, I mean a government which does what the people want. Nobody asked the British people in the last 20 or 30 years, do you want us to allow things to happen that will completely change the face of Britain? And of course it's happened. The British people were never asked and it has happened. And of course it happens in the United States exactly the same. Things happen in the United States and you are not asked. You're paying out colossal sums of money to states around the world, fighting strange wars without powers being granted to the president. All sorts of strange things are happening and yet you're not asked. And you're kidded that this is democracy. Your strange democratic process in the United States results in you ending up with people like Jimmy Carter, and you're told this is the finest American citizen that we can produce. Obviously, there's something wrong with the democratic systems around the world. Winston Churchill, of course, wasn't a product of a democratic system at all. He foisted himself upon the British people in May 1940, and we rapidly disembarrassed ourselves of that gentleman in May 1945 when the end of the war came, because the British people in their wisdom saw that they didn't want Winston Churchill to continue in office one moment longer. The damage, of course, by that time was done. 5 years in office of this drunken gentleman, and he had disembarrassed Britain of an empire and of all their assets. Nothing was left. You may wonder why I used the word drunk about Churchill, and the answer is not only that he was just occasionally slightly tipsy, as the way lots of people probably get. He had a congenital problem. He inherited it from his father. He passed it on to his son, Randolph Churchill, a very famous writer. He passed it on to his daughter, Sarah Churchill, who was constantly being locked up as drunk and disorderly and put away in Holloway Women's Prison in the centre of London, although her father was Prime Minister. And Randolph, in turn, passed on this congenital defect to his son, the present Winston Churchill. It's a great tragedy, and normally you don't make anything out about it. It's like when you find out there's a congenital defect in the family, you don't exactly go running around making capital out of it. But Winston Churchill wasn't just drunk in charge of an automobile, he was drunk in charge of an empire, drunk in charge of a country, and he took decisions in an intoxicated state that very often cost the lives of tens of thousands of empire and Commonwealth citizens. Matter of great indifference to yourselves as Americans, of course. In fact, it probably came to a great advantage to Americans, because if we'd had a real man as Prime Minister, if we'd had a Prime Minister who was not like Winston Churchill himself half American, which is something the English all too often forget, then England would now be the predominant force in the world, and not yourselves, not the Soviet Union. But unfortunately, Winston Churchill, unfortunately from my point of view, of course, unfortunately, Winston Churchill sold out to the Americans because he saw no reason not to. When Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, Roosevelt looked up from his office table in the Oval Office of the White House and said, well, I suppose he's the only man the British have for the job, but it's a pity because he's a drunken bum. And these are the quality of the documents I've got. You never heard quotations like that, but if you've got enough private diaries from around Churchill and around Roosevelt, you know exactly what's been saying. At the beginning of the chapter called Chapter 20, Tit for Tat in this book, you see Sumner Welles, who was the Deputy Undersecretary of State here in the United States in 1940. Sumner Welles visited Europe in March 1940 to make a desperate attempt to get peace. He visited Hitler, he visited Mussolini, he visited Chamberlain, he visited their undersecretaries, and he visited Winston Churchill. March the 12th, 1940, he found Winston Churchill blind drunk behind the boardroom table in the Admiralty with an empty bottle of whiskey on the table. And Sumner Welles wrote in his report, 12 pages long. He began the report by saying, Winston Churchill received me in a state of complete intoxication, a bottle of whiskey empty at the side of him on the table, incoherent, unable to speak. And at the end of the 12 pages, he then writes, by this time 90 minutes had passed, and Winston Churchill had become somewhat more sober. A scandalous state of affairs, you might think, for somebody with the lives of tens of thousands of British sailors in his hands, Winston Churchill. But more serious was the fact that Sumner Welles went back to America and told everybody what he had seen. There was a side result, I write, of the Sumner Welles meeting with Churchill that did great harm. Welles put it about official Washington that the famous Englishman was an alcoholic. He told Ickes that Churchill was a drunken bum. He told Burley, that's Adolf Burley, the State Department, that he'd found the First Lord of the Admiralty quite drunk. He was explicit about it in his report to Roosevelt, which I just mentioned. The latter passed it around North America. Roosevelt regretted to the visiting Prime Minister of Canada that Winston seemed to be drinking too much. He amplified this a few days later to the remark that Churchill is tight most of the time. This is shameful, wrote Prime Minister Mackenzie King, the Canadian Prime Minister, scandalized in his diary. This is shameful that he should have been in this condition when some of the world went to see him. It's that arrogance and the assumed there's nothing wrong with arrogance. I've always said that it's being arrogant that makes us British great, of course. We go to great expense and trouble to make our children arrogant. If we sent our children to Eton and they came back without arrogance, we demand a refund, I think. That isn't exactly what the complaint was against Churchill. The complaint was that he was drunk. And the interesting thing is, and I draw this to the attention of those of you who are historians or academics, either listening at this moment or listening later on to this tape. If you go to the archives and you get out the volumes of the Foreign Relations of the United States, which are the publications by the US government printing office of the State Department papers, you'll find Sumner Welles' report, this diplomat's report on his visit to Churchill, and not a mention of Churchill's drunkenness. It's been cut out. But if you go to the Roosevelt archives in Hyde Park, in New York State, you find Roosevelt's report from Sumner Welles, the original document Sumner Welles signed with those sentences included. This is why I never use published volumes. I never use diaries that have been printed somewhere else. I never use the printed volumes of documents because you can be absolutely certain that the bits that are vital to an understanding of history have been cut out. If you look in the British Cabinet minutes, for example, even if you go into the archives in Britain, you find this. If you go into look in the British Cabinet minutes in 1940, June 1940, you'll find important paragraphs have been blanked out. You're not given the original Cabinet minutes, although it's over 50 years ago nearly. 47 years ago now, 1940, and there's a 30-year rule operating in England which says we can see all documents over 30 years old. We don't have a Freedom of Information Act, but something very similar in that respect, as far as it's over 30 years ago. If you see the War Cabinet minutes, you find that certain paragraphs have been blanked out in the photocopies, so you can't read them. And it's only when you go and look in the private diaries of people like Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, or Lord Beaverbrook, or Neville Chamberlain, the former Prime Minister, that you find out what Churchill was saying that afternoon. I've quoted it here in this book, and you'll find it's interesting that when Adolf Hitler made his great peace plan in the summer of 1940, which none of the other academics have heard about, and at present they're down in Australia now tearing their hair out. We've left the whole of Australia on fire with this book, ladies and gentlemen. They're tearing each other's hair out. They're screaming blue murder. The newspaper columns, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Melbourne Age, the press, all over Australia is in flames now with people defending the book and people attacking it, which is how I like it. We've set a cat among the pigeons. Or as the Germans say, ein Hecht in Karpfenteich. So the important thing is that summer of 1940, Winston Churchill in cabinet said, I think that we would be wrong not to accept Mr. Hitler's peace offer. It's not just David Irving saying it. In other words, Winston Churchill himself said it in that cabinet meeting, which is why it's been blanked out so we can't read it. Because it's embarrassing for us to have to admit now, 47 years later, to anyone who can find the original quotations by Churchill in Lord Halifax's diary, that we could have got out of the war in 1940 with the British Empire intact. Not only that, of course, the Jews down in Australia screaming blue murder at me and saying, there's Irving again, he's whitewashing Hitler. He's denigrating that fine man, and he's whitewashing Hitler. He's up to his usual tricks, just what's to be expected of a neo-fascist and a Nazi and all the rest of it. So I said, wait a minute, gentlemen, brethren, wait a minute. I say, pay attention to what I'm saying. Watch my lips. If the war had ended in 1940, how many of those 6 million, or whatever figure you say is the right one, would have died? Because all of them, whoever died, however many it was, from 1940 onwards, they all died in that period from 1940 onwards. If they all died in that period from 1940 onwards, if the war had ended, the other Holocaust, Mr. Churchill's Holocaust, if that had ended in 1940, in June, then the trademarked Holocaust, the killing of millions of innocent people, whatever side, German, French, Poles, Belgians, Hungarians, the bombing war, the extermination of minorities, whatever it was, wouldn't have taken place. And then this, of course, is rather confusing for our position because they haven't thought of this. And there's nothing more embarrassing to be confronted with an obvious solution that you haven't thought of. This is why the smear tactics begin, of course, why they've been frantically trying to catch up with lost ground in Australia for the last 6 weeks. First of all, they've been saying Irving is a fascist, then they've been saying the book is rubbish, and then they've been saying, well, of course, he's got good sources, and then they look around and say, who let him in anyway? Who let him in? The same thing happened in New Zealand. Telephone calls to the New Zealand public radio service there saying if we had had our way, Irving wouldn't have been given a visa to come in. It was touch and go, and I say this in this small confidential circle, fully aware that nothing of this will go any further. That when you go to New Zealand, you have to fill in a declaration saying that you've never been arrested or deported from anywhere. And any of my enemies could easily have gone to the magazines. They could have gone to the authorities with my own traveling brochure with a photograph of me being arrested and deported from Austria. Here, arrested in Vienna and deported. But then, of course, they would have had to admit that in the bottom paragraph, it shows that 2 years later, after fighting manfully through the Viennese law courts, the Austrian government was forced to cringingly apologize to me and pay me colossal compensation for having wrongfully arrested me and wrongfully deported me. So I'm interested to see what will happen next if the New Zealanders try to keep me out on that account next time. But this is the methods they have to use. The interesting thing is, the book has now been on sale in Australia, how long? September the 12th to today, 5 weeks. And all the newspaper articles have been dedicated to attacking me, or to attacking Raymond White, or perhaps more justifiably to attacking certain other people, but not dedicated to attacking what is in the book at all. They can't attack it because the archives are on our side. And they're baffled by the fact that they hadn't themselves spotted that in Winston Churchill's file on Dunkirk, again, you're only given a bound volume of photocopies, you're not given the original file in the archives, all the way through of blank pages interspersed, which they had always assumed, I suppose, the other academics had assumed how nice of the British archivists to put in blank pages to keep the documents apart. But if you look closer, you see that the blank pages are numbered too. So obviously they're inserted in place of documents that have been taken out. And then the academics, they say to themselves, well, never mind, who knows, it's probably unimportant material. But of course it's the embarrassing documents that have been removed. And the only way to find out what's been removed in the Dunkirk file is to do what I did, which is to go and see the widow of the French Prime Minister of 1940. Still alive, Monsieur Paul Reynaud, he died years ago, but his widow is still alive, a dear old one-armed lady who doesn't very much like her husband because her late husband was a notorious womanizer and in fact decapitated one of his previous womenfolk in a car accident a few days after Mr. Churchill said, poor Madame Laporte, I think she's losing her head. Most unfortunate because that's what then happened. It's all referred to in a footnote here, a little academic footnote. And if you go to the archives, as I did, I persuaded Madame Paul Reynaud, the disenchanted widow, to use her one remaining good arm to sign a document authorizing me to go and see her husband's papers in the French National Archives. And lo and behold, there are some of the letters that we have so tediously removed from Mr. Winston Churchill's file so that no historian can read them. And when you read them, then you find out the true story about Dunkirk. Or a month later, you find out also the true story about why we British sank the French fleet at Oran, or as the French call it, Mers el-Kabir. We sank the fleet of our own allies deliberately. We went in there and bombarded it, killing 2,000 French sailors on July the 3rd, 1940, because Mr. Churchill made a translation mistake. His French was never very good. On this occasion, he made a catastrophic translation mistake with the regular French word contrôle, which doesn't mean control, it means supervision. But Churchill got it wrong. He ordered the French fleet sunk, and he's probably hoping against hope in his grave even now that no one spotted this schoolboy translation mistake he made. Somebody has. The prick. Me. It's in the book. It's in the book. The whole chapter is called A Misunderstanding Between Friends. So you see, this book is going to revolutionize the writing of Winston Churchill. One radio interviewer said to me, Mr. Irving, what do you hope you've achieved for listeners by writing this book about Churchill? I said, they can clear out all their other Churchill books and get just this one because it's going to take up less space, and they're going to find it takes much less time to read this book than to read all the other ones, and they're going to learn a lot more truth and wisdom. And that's the way it's going to be, because they may not like my conclusions from what but they can't deny the fact that I've got the sources. Look at just inside, not even on page 1. Look on the inside of the cover, and you see Churchill's diary. It was on his desk throughout the war, all the way through. There's this volume ends in June 1941. It was on his desk throughout the war. He hasn't got it anymore. It was stolen from him in the closing months of the war, in the closing days of the war, in fact, by his bodyguard, his Scotland Yard detective, Commander Tommy Thompson. Stole it. The family still has it. Commander Tommy Thompson is now dead, but his godson has it. And the godson, knowing that I was going to spend a lot of money doing the research on this book, came and offered it to me for £250,000, the Churchill diaries. Nobody else has ever used them. And they're vital. I had the same kind of thing for the Hitler book. You need to know what somebody's doing minute by minute, day by day, throughout the day in order to be able to draw certain conclusions. And the son said to me, Mr. Irving, I want you to have these diaries because I'm so deeply impressed by the work you did on Hitler. I think you're the only true researcher for truth. And I had the impression he was going to let me have the diaries, but somehow over the next few days the figure of £250,000 was mentioned. And I don't have that kind of money, but I didn't want to admit that I didn't have that kind of money, so I got on my English high horse and I said, I'm frightfully sorry. But if you expect to sell me stolen property, I'm afraid I'm not in the market. We don't buy stolen property. I will rent it from you. I've rented the diaries from him for £5,000, and that's why I am the only author who's ever made use of them. The others can't afford to have them. Commander Tommy Thompson's Godson, I think, has now split them up, and he's selling them on the American autograph market, so they're now vanished for all time. I've got a very good microfilm copies, which I'm prepared to make available to the archives in due course. The important thing about having somebody's diary is you can draw conclusions like, for example, that the man Winston Churchill was a blubbering coward. Again, a most unattractive and unfavourable conclusion. Here's the Churchill diary here. I've just published here an excerpt of it. I can enlarge it slightly for you here. November 1940. In fact, it's the day of the famous raid on Coventry. November the 14th, 1940, 2 days before Churchill had been told by the Air Ministry Intelligence Service, the code breakers, we have decoded a German Air Force signal which says that there's going to be the biggest series of air raids ever on London. That's the conclusion we draw. Operation Moonlight Sonata, beginning on the first full moon night. The entire German Air Force is going to bomb night after night after night, day after day after day for 3 days and 3 nights, with Hermann Goering personally in charge. 1,000 bombers will obliterate the entire target. What is this target going to be, he says. And the Air Ministry says, well, target number 1 we couldn't decode. It's corrupt in the original telegram. Target number 2 is outer London. Target number 3 is the Thames Estuary. Target number 4 is the home counties around London. So it stands to reason target number 1 is the very centre of London going to be obliterated. Churchill draws on his desk calendar a bracket covering those 3 days. You can see it down the side. No appointments in London. The afternoon comes, November the 14th. He scurries out of the back garden gate, not out of the famous front door of number 10 Downing Street, but out of the back garden gate. There's a photograph of him scurrying out of that garden gate in our book. We managed to locate a photograph of him doing this to where his big black car is waiting. The big black bomb-proof Daimler. Try saying that, big black bomb-proof Daimler, right. He scurries into the car, gets into it, and is about to drive off when a dispatch rider drives up with a message from the Air Ministry. He's in a hurry to get out of London before dusk falls and the bombers arrive. So he tells the driver, drive off, and he drives off, and he opens the message. And it's a message, only a few lines long, from the Air Ministry saying, Prime Minister, this afternoon at 3 o'clock, our radio intelligence planes detected where the German blind bombing beams intersect. They don't intersect over London, but they intersect over Coventry, 100 miles further north. It's the famous Coventry raid. Right. Churchill says, driver, back to number 10 Downing Street. You see, he wants to go. As he gets back to number 10 Downing Street, goes through the door, his staff greet him with astonishment. You notice he hasn't told his staff to take the day off the next 3 days to go and play golf in the countryside somewhere. He's left the whole of London waiting there because he doesn't care really what happens to them. He has betaken his own little portly self out into the countryside, and he was going to leave everybody else to sweat it out. Operation Moonlight Sonata. But that isn't all. His staff say to him, Winston, why did you come back? And he says, I have just received this doleful piece of intelligence from the Air Ministry, and he shows them the empty envelope. I know this from Sir John Martin, his private secretary. I've just received this doleful piece of intelligence from the Air Ministry saying that tonight there is to be a vicious and barbarous Nazi attack on London. An attack on London, he says. And it would not be right for me to allow the citizens of this fine metropolis to believe that I am so coward and craven that I'm not prepared to put up with their trials and tribulations which they are asked to suffer night after night in the name of all that we hold dear. This is the true Winston Churchill, and that night he actually goes up on the roof of number 10 Downing Street, unbuttons his waistcoat, tucks his thumbs into his waistcoat, and says, let these bombers come and do their worst. I am prepared for them. Knowing full well, of course, that at that very moment the Nazi bombers were unloading their cargoes of death over Coventry, 100 miles to the north. We must not forget in reading history now, what we've known ever since 1975 publicly, but I've known it some years before then, that Winston Churchill was one of the very few people who was reading Hitler's secret signals, the Enigma secret. Our computer code breakers were breaking the German Air Force code ever since May 1940. And this tells us not only that Winston Churchill knew night after night what was the real target. In fact, I've quoted in here, and you'll find it, ladies and gentlemen, the Royal Air Force fighter